Well, welcome to this Connecting the Dots webinar, in which we will be talking about what it means to be a peace church in the Presbyterian Church USA. And my name is Ben Daniel. I'm the pastor of Montclair Presbyterian Church in Oakland, California. I'm also a member of Presbyterian Peace Fellowship's Peace Church Working Group, a group which is helping congregations around the denomination think about what it means to be a peace church and discern if maybe they themselves would like to be a peace church. And I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church USA's anti-militarism working group, which is part of the Matthew 25 initiative, and it is the group which is sponsoring this particular webinar. And I'd like to introduce some of the panelists, or all of the panelists with us this morning. Mark Davidson is the pastor emeritus, Church of the Reconciliation in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Marilyn White is a ruling elder from Faith Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas. Jeff Browning is a former campus pastor at Stanford University. He's been a peace advocate for the Presbytery of San Jose, and a parish associate at First Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto. I'd also like to acknowledge Simon Dung, who's been he's kind of running the technical side of this and is being a great help to us. Also, Ryan White is a member of the anti-militarism working group, and he is here. He's been done a lot of help to get this going, get this this webinar off the ground. I want to say that this is a really important question for us to be talking about, whether to be a peace church. Your congregation may or may not decide that it wants to be a peace church. And that's okay. I'm glad you're here anyway, because talking about what it means to be a Christian in a time of war is an important conversation to have. You know, when the United States invaded Iraq back in the Bush years, 2003, I preached what I think was a brilliant sermon about the war, in opposition to the war. This was in San Jose, where I was the pastor of Foothill Presbyterian Church at the time. It was a brilliant sermon, but what I realized afterwards, in the fallout that I experienced after having preached it, is that regardless of how good the sermon was, it was too late for me to start talking about the war when our country was already at war. I needed to have started talking about a Christian response to warfare before our country went to war, before it was too late to talk about it. One of the things I learned in the aftermath was that something like fewer than 10% of churches talked about the war after the invasion of Iraq, and only 16% of Americans looked to their faith to help them decide whether or not the war was moral. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation, whether your congregation decides it wants to be a peace church or whether you're just here for the listening and the sharing. I'm glad we're having the conversation, because it's important now, while our country is not formally at war, to start having these conversations. One of the things that I want to say about this is that to declare yourself a peace church, we sort of think of this as a step past the Presbyterian Church USA's commitment to peacemaking, which was something that started in the 1980s. And we have a poll for you, because we're interested in knowing how many congregations or how many participants are from congregations which have declared themselves or made this commitment to peacemaking. And I think that, Simon, I think you're going to put up a poll for us to use. Is that correct? And the other thing I want to say, sort of as a getting information by way of information, is that interpretation is available. So if you speak Korean, o si hablas en español, you can listen to translation of this, to interpretation in real time. So anyway, the poll is up to see whether your congregation participated in the or made that commitment to peacemaking. All right, so before we move along with the rest of this this webinar today, I want to invoke God's grace upon us. I want to say that my prayer is that the spirit of peace will be upon us in this conversation. The Spirit will lead us and guide us and give us strength and hope, and maybe even some good humor as we enter into a conversation which is challenging and difficult for many of us. So with that invocation of God's blessing and God's blessings of peace, I would like to invite Marilyn to begin our, I'd like to invite Mark to begin an overview of peace churches historically and the peace discernment within the PCUSA. So Mark, I'd like to pass it off to you.
Thank you, Ben, and good to be with everyone on this Connecting the Dots webinar. It was my great privilege to be asked to moderate the peace discernment process in our denomination between 2010 and 2016. Our task in that process was to take stock of the times. You could say that the peacemaking, the believer's calling in 1980 was a kind of high water mark for peacemaking in the history of our denomination. But a lot had happened by 2010 since the days of the decade of peacemaking, as the 80s was sometimes called. And our task was to take stock of the times. There had been 9/11, 3 Middle East wars, the end of the Cold War, geopolitical shifts from a bipolar to a unipolar world, frequent and rampant gun violence in our culture, bloated military spending, and so much more. So we were invited to study intensively on behalf of the denomination, and then to bring back our findings, also to invite the denomination to join with us in discernment on things like terrorism, militarism, violence in our culture, and essentially to ask, where are we as a Presbyterian church with respect to peacemaking? And our remit from the General Assembly specifically tasked us with taking a fresh look at nonviolence. And this was a reflection of the fact that since the 80s, there had been the Jesus Seminar and a number of really important studies of the teachings of Jesus and of nonviolence. Walter Wink's major works happened during that period of time, and other biblical scholars as well. So there was a sense of, we need to look at this. We were resourced for this work by Carl Horton from the Peacemaking Program, Chris Ioso from the Advisory Council on Social Witness Policy, and Roger Powers from the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, who was our writer and consultant. Joining me on the peace discernment process were 5 others from the denomination, elders and pastors, professors, young people, everyone with significant international experience and deep involvement in the life of the church. We met regularly, and we also had consultations over that period of time with military chaplains, with the Presbyterian colleges, with Presbyterian social ethicists, biblical theologians. We talked to PCUSA elders working in the State Department. We consulted with Presbyterian Research Services, AC SWAP, PPF. I mean, it was a broad take on what was going on in our church and in our culture. And we spanned 3 General Assemblies: Pittsburgh in 2012, Detroit 2014, and Portland in 2016. We produced a document called Discovering the Gospel of Peace Anew, which was an invitation to the whole church to help us with this and to join in discernment. And we did get feedback from many churches that those were some extremely significant conversations about peace and the struggles that our members were having with these important issues. Then in 2016 at Portland, we had the General Assembly approved 5 peace affirmations and also a study called Risking Peace in a Violent World. And that was passed overwhelmingly. There were very few votes against it. It was received warmly by the General Assembly. It was a great honor to be part of that work over those 6 years. And then in 2018, San Jose Presbytery put forward a resolution asking for the recognition of peace churches. And the General Assembly voted to recognize and commend those churches who had declared themselves as peace churches within the Presbyterian Church, to list such churches on the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program's website, and to encourage other churches to engage in discernment, specifically about how to respond to the challenges of violence, militarism, and war, and that some would embrace the principles of nonviolence and declare themselves to be peace churches. So that's a brief overview of the history and how we got here. There are 5 peace churches within the denomination. Those are listed on the Presbyterian Peacemaking website, and we would like to invite everyone to discern if they are called in their denominational and congregational settings to take this additional step beyond declaring themselves a peacemaking congregation. I'm also asked to say something about the definition of a peace church. Let me just briefly mention that. I think there are really 2 things that signify a peace church within the Presbyterian tradition. A peace church recognizes that war and militarism are inconsistent with the gospel of Christ and Jesus's example of nonviolence, and it confesses that the Christian church has historically been complicit in the world's violence. Second thing, a peace church challenges the adequacy of just war or justifiable war theory and theology, and understands that injustice, poverty, and oppression are the foundations of violence and war. I don't think I'll take the time to read every single one of the several dots that mark a peace church and what it does or what we are doing. But I'll just highlight a couple of them. Peace churches work diligently to dismantle and disavow structures and systems of violence, oppose militarism, the global expansion of the U.S. military and the war economy, disavow war weaponry and violence in all circumstances as a means to resolve conflict, and promote the use of nonviolent means of conflict resolution, including mediation, conciliation, and peaceful resistance. Just a couple more. Care for the marginalized and oppressed through ministries of justice and reconciliation so as to prevent the escalation of conflict into violence and war. A firm conscientious objection in all its forms as a proper, faithful expression of non-participation in warfare. And just generally equip people as they discern their Christian response to war. And the final one I'll mention is act in additional ways guided by the Holy Spirit that are consistent with being a Presbyterian peace church within the Presbyterian Church USA. So I think that covers my charge. So great to be with everybody. This some historical background for how we got here.
Thank you, Mark. And now I'd like to invite Marilyn, and Marilyn and I will be talking a little about the process that our churches went through to become peace churches. And because it's, I think every congregation has its own path. And so you're going to get a little snippet of 2 paths. So go ahead, Marilyn.
Thank you. So when I moved to Austin and joined Faith Presbyterian Church in 2006, the pastor suggested that as a way of contributing to the congregation, I might be a good person to initiate projects to involve the congregation in peacemaking. The church was already very strong in community outreach and LGBT inclusion, but they hadn't done much from a global perspective. And that began to change. So we started small by hosting international peacemakers and writing letters to mission co-workers. And then Congressman Lloyd Doggett's daughter asked us to volunteer to help her bring the Iraqi Shoe Project to town that commemorated victims of the war in Iraq. And then we became involved with refugee organizations who were resisting deportations. And we were asked to organize a community event to recognize the anniversary of 9/11. So as we were becoming more active in peacemaking, we got the opportunity, as Mark described, to participate in the discernment process. And we jumped at the chance to do the study and provide feedback to the denomination during that process. After 2016, when that was completed, some congregations declared themselves to be peace churches. And one of them, as Mark described, in Palo Alto, wrote an overture seeking recognition and encouragement for peace congregations. And we decided to ask our presbytery to concur. And as we were discussing the overture, some on the session asked, why aren't we a peace church? So we began a process to see if that was something we wanted to do. Our adult education class spent several weeks discussing this. Since we were already familiar with the Peace Church Overture and the results of the church-wide discernment process, we had a bit of a head start. So in our study, and we did not have a curriculum like is available now, so we were kind of on our own here, but we emphasized sharing personal beliefs about militarism and nonviolence. And our goal was to create our own statement of what we believed, and then to see if that made us a peace church or perhaps something else. We have quite a few military families and military veterans in our congregation, and this proved to be both a challenge and an asset. On the one hand, no one wanted to be critical of the choice some had made to serve in the military and the sincere patriotism behind that choice. On the other hand, veterans are often the least naive about the realities of war and the limits of military power. We gradually found a place of consensus for our congregation, even if some individuals wanted to reserve for themselves the possibility of supporting a particular war. We all felt that there was a need for an institutional voice that could be relied upon to be consistently anti-war without exception. And that institutional voice should be the church. So the class decided to prepare a statement to present to the session, and it said, Faith Presbyterian Church is a peace church. We follow Jesus of Nazareth, the Prince of Peace. We are committed to moving our country and the world beyond war through nonviolent alternatives to conflict. We strive to embody the command to love God and neighbor by following the path of nonviolence. For violence in all of its forms, including war and militarism, has no power to save us. That's short and pretty simple. We then expanded that very short and simple statement with reaffirming our support for the commitment to peacemaking, which, we had done decades earlier, and also to the 5 affirmations that represented the 6-year church-wide discernment process. Our session decided to present the statement to the congregation before they voted on it, and this was done at the annual congregational meeting. The response was enthusiastic support. And then after the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program published the current definition of what a peace church is, and Mark read portions of that to you, our session discussed it and voted to endorse it so that we could ensure that we would continue to be counted as a Presbyterian peace church. But we continue to use our own statement as our unique identity, and I encourage your church to write their own statement as well, because I do believe there's room in this movement for nuance and differing priorities. I can't say we do very much differently as a peace church. We have an electronic sign and we bless the community with peace messages. We often rely on Presbyterian Peace Fellowship for resources to use in worship when there's a situation like Ukraine or a mass shooting. And there's just a general expectation now that our church will be a voice for peace in all situations. And it's not even very controversial. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And I want to give a brief outline of what our church did. And I'll start by saying I don't honestly remember how this first came up in our conversations. But it was about 2016, about the time that First Pres Palo Alto was bringing us overture through the Presbytery of San Jose, where I had served a long time, and I was friends with Jeff, and so I was kind of in touch with what was going on there, and impressed with the stuff that was coming out of the General Assembly, as were members of our church's Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee. But the other thing that was going on then is that I have 3 children, one of them two girls and a boy, and that my son was turning 11 in 2016, and I began to think about what was going to happen when he would have to register for the draft, and I was particularly inspired to get us motivated as a congregation to do peacemaking, to become a peace church, so that my son and other young men growing up in the church would have the option of declaring themselves to be conscientious objectors should there be a draft. And this is also true for my daughters and the young women in the church, but to date, that's still not there's still not a draft for women. And so what we did is the Peace and Justice Committee of our congregation formed a task force to start thinking about being a peace church and writing up a proposal. And so I wrote an initial peace church declaration, and I think that the task force spent about a year editing and revising and changing and fixing it. And that was the whole process was actually really life-giving, but that in particular, that part of it was really wonderful, because we really thought and prayed and deliberated together in ways that I felt were really, that it made me happy. There are some really happy memories of that time. And then we sent our revisions to the Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee, some of whom had also served on the task force, but we then did further, I think several months doing further revisions with the input from the Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee. And then we sent it to the session, and the session took a couple months to add changes and revisions. And then we got input from we published this, sent it out to the congregation, and invited feedback from the congregation, some of which we included in further revisions. And finally, we took action to declare ourselves a peace church on Sunday, November 11th, 2018, which happened to be the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, which felt like a good time to do it. But what I'm saying is it took us 2 years. And it was 2 years of really rich conversations. And I know that some of the folks who were involved in that process are actually on the webinar now. And so I'm grateful. Those remain some really important discussions. I don't think, though, I have to be perfectly transparent. I don't think we are in 100% in agreement in our congregation. Like with Marilyn's church, we have members who are either veterans themselves, or they have children who are serving, people who just see things differently. I think that our vote was about 90% to 10% when we voted on it. I think if we were to vote on it today after Ukraine, our vote would be maybe 75-25. I think that it's a living, the idea of being a peace church is a living thing for us. It didn't, the conversation didn't stop in 2018. And I'm interested to see what happens. My son turns 18 in June, and he has expressed a desire to declare himself a conscientious objector. And so he will be bringing a statement to that effect to the session sometime this spring. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with our conversations with that process. He will declare himself a conscientious objector with the session's approval, and then register himself with the stated clerk of our denomination, something that's a few people have done in Jeff's church, and I think maybe a few other churches. It's not something that a lot of folks have done, but I certainly hope that more people will do this. Anyway, so it's a living conversation. I think it's a rich conversation. And as I said earlier in the, as I said earlier in my introduction, it's one that I'm glad we're having before the United States becomes directly involved in another war. I mean, and so I'm, and I hope that having this conversation before the next war is something that all of us can do. Marilyn mentioned that when her congregation was going through this process, and this is certainly true for us as well, there was no curriculum. We were just sort of doing it on our own. There wasn't even a solid definition for Peace Church. But we now have those resources. They're available for you. And so if you're interested in learning if you're interested in having some guidance or the supportive experience, we have things like a definition of what it means to be a Peace Church, and we have a curriculum. And the curriculum is one that we worked on together and would like to introduce to you now. And so I'm going to invite Mark to begin the introduction of the curriculum, and then I will follow. And then we're going to turn it over to Jeff, who has done some wonderful work also with the curriculum and providing some resources for that. But Mark, go ahead. Why don't you begin the introduction to the curriculum?
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, we are heirs in the Presbyterian Church to some wonderful resources over the years. I remember once somebody describing the Presbyterian church witness to society as the Cadillac version. So, I mean, we really have done wonderful things over the years. And some of those studies were part of what we drew upon and updated. And there are three Bible studies, if you will, or adult education studies. One on the nonviolence in the teachings of Jesus, nonviolence in the epistles in the New Testament, and then nonviolence in the early church. And these were adapted from an earlier study in the peacemaking program and updated, and I took on that task, and I found it enormously rewarding to go back to some of these landmark studies by biblical theologians like Walter Wink, and also to go back to the teachings of Dr. King and Gandhi and a number of these luminary figures in the history of nonviolence. So, the hope in these studies is that, the scripture and the guidance from the Word of God has always been a really important part of our tradition as Presbyterians. What does the Word say? What do the teachings of Jesus have to say about nonviolence? And so in that one on the teachings of Jesus, we look at Matthew 5:38-39, which is the turn the other cheek teaching. What does that really mean? What's there? And there are some surprising insights that come from fresh translations and a second look at what that means. Many people assume that means sort of doormat theology. It's something quite different than that when you look into it. We looked at Mark 13 and Luke 22. The Luke 22 is to put away the sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And, we're familiar with these teachings, but what do they mean and how do people interpret them? So there's an opportunity to look at the teachings of Jesus and specifically nonviolence in the teachings of Jesus. Another module on nonviolence in the epistles. We look at Romans 12, which is be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. But then also Romans 13, which talks about being submissive to the state. So what do you do with those two? What kinds of questions lead us into deeper insights? And then 1 Peter 3, which has wonderful things to say about nonviolence as a personal discipline for Christians. Then nonviolence in the early church, we looked at Justin Martyr, Hippolytus, and Eusebius. And again, some really surprising insights of that period in Christian history, church history, when the church was an alternative to the dominant culture, and specifically around participation in violence and war. And so very wonderful resources. The times that these have been used in local churches, They always say there's never enough time. Everybody wants to talk. Everybody has insights. So echoing what Ben said about how rich these conversations can be in the local church context. So those are the just a very, very brief overview of those three components. And we're ready to help in any way as you're adapting these studies to your own context. I designed them for two 60-minute sessions. Many churches don't have enough time to do 6 of these, 2 for each one of these 3 modules, but they can be adapted, and glad to help resource any church that would like to do that.
Thank you, Mark. And so then I wrote the last section of the curriculum, which really picks up where Mark's work ends. So the early church was, for the most part, pacifist. It was for the most part rejected military violence as being moral. After the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its official religion, and Christianity became the dominant religion of Rome, that changed. And starting with Augustine, there started to be a rethinking of the church's pacifism, and over years, Christian ideas about when and why and how military force can be justifiable or even necessary, those opinions have evolved over time. And so the last section is a very brief and kind of surface level introduction to how how Christian thinking about militarism and military violence has shifted and evolved over time. And special attention is given to what I would consider to be the majority opinion among Christians today, particularly American Protestant Christians today, which is the concept of just war theory and the criteria that are used by ethicists and theologians to think about when war is justifiable or even necessary. And so there's a presentation of just war theory and a critique of just war theory, and then a special attention, though, is given to the war in Ukraine and to World War II, to think through, to use World War II in particular, but also the Ukrainian war as test cases for pacifism. Because if there are chinks in the armor of pacifism, it's World War II historically, and I think the war in Ukraine currently. Those are questions that anybody who is part of a peace church, anybody who is a pacifist and isn't wrestling with those two wars, probably isn't paying attention. And so we really want people to, and this is actually part of the richness of these discussions, is looking at World War II, looking at Ukraine, which when we did it, Ukraine wasn't a thing, but looking at Ukraine, looking at World War II, having these really challenging and uncomfortable sometimes conversations about our assumptions and about what we believe. It's sometimes difficult, but I think a really good thing. So anyway, so that's the final part of the curriculum per se. But we also have I think a really wonderful resource, which I think any group which is going to be involved in discussions, any congregation that's going to be involved in discussions about being a peace church can really benefit, as I have, from the inventory of conscience that we have, which is something that Jeff Browning developed. And so I'm going to turn give the floor to Jeff to talk about the inventory of conscience surveys.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, well, the inventory of conscience actually came about many years, quite a few while before we had discussions about becoming a peace church. And that is in confirmation classes for young people. Because as young people were going through confirmation class and deciding whether or not they wanted to join the church, and we were talking about Jesus and, and nonviolence and justice and all of these concerns. It occurred to me that how do we really know what we believe about the use of violence and war? And that nobody has really done anything to help us discern that. And so I developed a tool called the Inventory of Conscience. At the time, it was just a manual paper inventory. And we used it with our confirmands. And through that process, we've had about a half dozen young people declare themselves to be conscientious objectors in the Presbyterian Church. And you may not know, not everybody knows or realizes that young men are still required by law to register for the draft. And so if they are expected to register for the draft, it seems appropriate for us as Christians, as people who care about our young people, to help them have a conversation about what it means to follow their conscience. You know, what do you actually believe about the use of violence and war? Now, this is not a process whereby we would try to force them to believe one thing over another, but to help them to identify what it is that they believe about these things, and then encourage them to follow their conscience. And so in the same way with the Peace Church curriculum, that is what we tried to do. We realized that the same issue comes up for us. How do we know what we believe about the use of violence and war? For most of us, most all of us, me included, we take our cues from the culture around us, from the movies, from the television shows, from what we see out on the street. And oftentimes it is something that aligns with what Walter Wink calls a myth of redemptive violence. And that is that we think that violence will save us. So, but as Christians, what do we believe? What are we called to respond? Are we called just to follow what the culture is telling us, is trying to persuade us, or do we follow the teachings of Jesus? And so this is kind of set up to help all of us identify what we actually believe about the use of violence and war. So I'm going to put up a couple of polls here. On this poll, you'll have an opportunity to identify where you think you are on the spectrum between a strict pacifist and a strict non-pacifist. So please answer the poll and respond to the poll here that Simon is going to put up for us.
And definitions of these terms are in the chat for your reference.
Yes, thank you, Simon, for doing that. So strict pacifist, means that we must be consistent with the goal that we seek. That violence, that the means will lead to a violent means will lead to a violent result. All the way to, let's see, strict non-pacifist, basically that the ends justify the means, which is what we see in most of our culture.
I'll leave the poll up for just another second or two, and then I'll end it and I'll show
Okay.
the results.
All right. Thank you, Simon. So this, so the inventory of conscience, what it does is it, after you respond to a series of questions, and based on those questions, it helps you to identify where you land on this spectrum between strict pacifist and strict non-pacifist. And when we say pacifist, I think it's important to recognize that we don't mean passivity. We mean nonviolence. And that's an important distinction. And I would just say also that in our church, when we went through the process of deciding whether or not to become a peace church, our church, people said that these were some of the most powerful conversations that we had. All right, well, that's helpful. That's very good. Thank you for all of you who responded to that. I'd like to put up one more poll, and that is, what do you think, where do you think Jesus would land on this poll? Where do you think Jesus would land on that spectrum between strict pacifist and strict non-pacifist? Because as Christians, we are attempting to follow Jesus. We're the Jesus followers. And so it kind of makes a difference where we think Jesus is leading us. If we're trying to follow Jesus' example, if we are attempting to be made into the image of Christ, then how do we do that? And sometimes there are things that Christ is calling me to that are very hard for me to accept. But I have to admit that Jesus is still calling me in that direction. So it's kind of a tussle that we sometimes have.
Just a little bit more for folks to respond. Got about 3/4 of folks that have participated in this poll.
Great. So the inventory of conscience is the first step. There's nothing that says that you have to follow the curriculum in the order that they are in there, but the inventory of conscience is kind of a good place to begin to identify where each of you are on this spectrum, so that you can kind of say, oh, well, that's interesting. And we encourage, so interesting, 65% strict pacifist, and even one who's a strict non-pacifist. That's interesting too. Yeah, very interesting. So what's helpful about this is just not as a way of judging one another, but as a way of having a conversation about, oh, tell me more about your feelings about these things, as a way for us to have a conversation and to learn more about one another, because none of us has all the answers here. And what we are attempting to do is to learn from one another and to learn what Jesus is calling us to in the name of justice and peace. So, thank you. Ben?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I want to, we're now going to move to the, I believe, we're going to move the time in our webinar where we will have questions and answers. And you can do that using the Q&A function, the little widget on the bottom. Well, it's, for me, it's on the bottom of my screen. And I will try to go through and look at some of the questions. I can't guarantee we'll get to all the questions that are asked, but we will ask, we will certainly try to engage, get involved in some of this, what I hope will be the kind of life-giving conversation that we have had in our congregations on this topic. And if you have a question that you'd like a specific person to answer or to address, please include that in the questions. And feel free to take some time to ask your questions now. So the next thing I want to say is that we're going to try to do that poll about whether your church has taken made the commitment to peacemaking again. Apparently, it was we could have framed the question a little more accurately. So Simon's going to send that poll around again during this time as well. So okay, and I will. I'm looking at so we have a couple of questions about being a conscientious objector, and I'm just looking at the top of this, and one of them is the question of who at the church keeps a copy of the conscientious objector statements, and then another question, which is, and maybe I think, Jeff, you might be the person to address, but also can any of the speakers address the economic implications on top of the moral implications of a young person in the U.S. taking the stand of being a conscientious objector? And Jeff, I don't know if you want to take this, but I believe you've done the most work with COs, but maybe Mark and Marilyn as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, the first question about who keeps a copy of the CO statements. So once the CO, young person presumably, writes a statement, they meet with their session, and the session accepts their statement, and then the pastor or session will send that off to the Office of General Assembly, and that will be received at the Office of General Assembly, and they will open a file and keep that statement on file. I recommend that the church also keep a record of, keep a file of those statements, and of course the person themselves, the young person or their family, keep their statement as well. We've had some challenges with getting a response back from the Office of the Stated Clerk affirming that this person is registered as a conscientious objector, and so I think they are moving faster with that now, because they didn't realize that this was actually, there weren't that many young people who were doing this. And once we started sending them statements, they realized that they needed to have a better process in place for these things. So hope that answers your question. I wasn't sure. Okay, well, this is interesting about peacemaking congregations as well.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, did you want to add?
Yeah, I saw the question from I think her name was Leslie Vogel. Leslie, if you're still there, about your son wanting to declare himself a CO, but being told that if he didn't register for the selective service, he could lose financial aid. Let me tell you the process that my sons went through. They're both 36 and 28 now, but when they were at that 18-year-old threshold, we got great counsel from the GI hotline and from peace activists in our congregation who are very familiar with this process. And I'd encourage you to check in with some of those folks. Plus, we have Bill Galvin as one of our group members, and he's with the Center on Conscience and War and works with conscientious objectors all the time. So if we can access that help, he would be a great resource for you. But let me finish with my story. What we were advised is that you can register for the selective service, but put on your form specifically, I am a conscientious objector, so that in that sense, you don't sacrifice financial aid, but you declare yourself up front and you're in the system that way. And you keep a copy of that. So if they say, "Oh, we lost that," no, you declared from the outset that you are a conscientious objector. And that means you really get both. You get the access to financial aid. You're not penalized in that sense, and you also get to make your case if that comes up. So I just would share that.
And I would just add that means that you need to be sure that you fill out a form rather than doing it online. So you have a form that you can get from the post office for registering, and then you can write across that conscientious objector. They don't allow you, there's no place to mark conscientious objector if you do it online.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you both. We have some questions about the war in Ukraine, which I think is good. I don't know that we're going to answer all those questions because there's a lot of wrestling to be done. But one question I think that's easy, yes or no, or at least it's in process, is a question about whether or not the Presbyterian Church USA has made any statement about the Ukraine war. Do any of you want to take that? Marilyn, do you have a knowledge of that?
Yes, so at the last General Assembly made a statement, and I think Jeff can speak to that. He was a commissioner at the General Assembly and was involved in that statement.
Yes, we did have a statement at this last one. I don't remember what the name of the statement was. Mark, remember, might be able to remind me. But it was a statement that identified very appropriately that we are supporting peace and justice, that we reject the attack, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and encourage both sides to seek peace and reconciliation through a diplomatic process. Is that right, Mark? Yeah,
that's the gist of it. We did also offer a rationale which pointed out a broader context than is usually discussed in the media. It's there, but you have to look a little more deeply, which challenges the assumption that this was a quote unprovoked attack. It provides the historical context, which shows a long-running dispute where the U.S. and NATO played quite a provocative role in bringing us to this brink. That does not in any way condone what Russia has done and continues to do, and there was firm language in the resolution condemning those actions, but at the same time saying at the end of the day, people are going to have to sit around a table and resolve, and why not do that sooner rather than later and save so much destruction and loss of life.
Do any of you, so there's a number of questions about how, a couple of questions about how does the Peace Church respond to military support for Ukraine? And what I can say is that, we've been kicking around some ideas in Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and trying to come up with a response. I don't think we have anything definite yet. my own opinion is that you can't fight your way to peace. I think that that's certainly reflective of what Martin Luther King would have said. But do any of you want to say anything about Ukraine specifically and what's going on there before we move on to some other things?
Well, we did have a webinar on the Christian nonviolence response to the invasion of Ukraine a few months ago, where we had interviewed Rick Gofford Chase and Deborah Lee, and that was a very helpful conversation. And basically saying that this is all part of the militarism that we are all caught up in, and the constantly seeking more and more weapons, and a response that is adding more fuel to the fire, whether that occurs in Ukraine or occurs down the road. So I encourage people to take a look at that webinar. I think that was a PPF webinar instead of a Presbyterian Mission Agency webinar. Maybe we can find that for you.
Let me just add one thing briefly to that. Some of you who've been part of the Presbyterian Church for some time might remember the name of Bruce Rigdon. Bruce was a professor at McCormick Theological Seminary and an expert on Russian Orthodoxy. And one of the things that Bruce did was led delegations of Presbyterians and other Christians from the U.S. to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, when everywhere we were hearing demonization of the other, both ways, coming at us and directing it toward our Russian siblings. And that was a really significant way to disarm some of the polarizing rhetoric and the demonizing that was going on, and bring us face to face with others across the boundaries of war and propaganda. And something like that is sorely needed again. But we do have history in our church of trying to cross the barricades and form deep personal connections, not mediated by propaganda and enemy making.
Thank you. I got a question directed at me, and so I will, and that it reflects another question that's in here. So I'll start. There's actually two parts to this question. I'm going to take them in reverse. One is, our congregations do anything to help people in the inner city? And I would actually add poor rural communities as well, to help the underprivileged folks have access to materials with conscientious objection. And I would say the answer to that question, and some of you whose churches, I don't know if any of you else are doing that. I think that's a challenge we face. And I think, Montclair Presbyterian Church, we're a fairly privileged congregation. I don't know about, and I know that Palo Alto is, also, that's the other congregation I know. It's in one of the most expensive zip codes in the nation. So that's a challenge for us, honestly. I would say, is how do we provide to children in rural communities like where I grew up, or in inner cities like other parts of my own Oakland has some pretty challenging neighborhoods where there's a lot of military recruitment. How do we reach out and try to provide to those young people the same resources we have? I think that is a huge challenge. But that raises up some of the economic issues, which was specifically brought up. What about the issue of militarism in the economy? And there's a way in which all of us, because we're in the United States and we pay taxes, are supporting a military economy. There's a way in which, it's almost impossible to decrease military spending in the United States, because military contractors are strong lobbyists, and they have jobs in so many districts, in congressional districts. So I wonder if, and that's a challenge. That's a challenge for us. I mean, my wife and I sometimes talk about trying to figure out where we can retire so that in a country that's doesn't have a heavily militarized economy. So those are questions that I wrestle with. And I'd like to invite maybe some of the other panelists. Marilyn, we've heard less from you. I don't know if you want to address this issue of militarism and the economy.
Yes, I think this is where the Matthew 25 movement and initiative in the church becomes so important, because as a whole, I think the Matthew 25 initiatives address economic justice, structural violence and racism, and it is included in the Matthew 25 charter that militarism is one of the things that's connected to all of this. So this working group, the anti-militarism working group, and the webinars they have, so important for everyone to take that content back into their congregations, include militarism as part of the conversations when we're talking about the economy, when we're talking about structural violence, and so forth.
Okay. Anybody else want to address the issues of militarism and the economy?
Well, I think it's a big issue. We spend more than 50% of our discretionary budget on federal budget on the military. That is the largest amount of any country in the world. And we spend at least as much as the next 10 countries combined, including China and Russia. So militarism is and spending on the military and sustaining something like 800 military outposts or bases around the world is a huge expense, especially when you think that we have people who are living on the street. Hundreds of thousands of people who are living on the street every single day. We have children who are hungry. This is an injustice and an outrage, in my opinion. And we need to speak out loudly and clearly about it.
I want to say, I was just sent a message by my friend Ryan, who's one of the co-hosts, who's done a lot of work to support us in this. He and I are on the anti-militarism working group together. And Ryan has reminded me that one of the upcoming Connecting the Dots webinars like this one will be on this very issue, the militarism and the economy. And so please stay tuned. I think it's going to be an excellent webinar. And so thank you, Ryan, for that reminder. And I hope you will all, stay tuned to these webinars, because it'll be I think it'll be a really important and good webinar. Any more thoughts from our panelists on the one of the questions is if we can define a conscientious objector. Do you want to?
I could probably speak to that. Conscientious objector, as it's defined now, is someone who is against all wars. We have, by reason of belief, it doesn't necessarily need to be a religious conviction, but it needs to be a strongly held belief. If Bill was on one of our panelists, he could speak to this more specifically. We have been attempting to get a reconsideration for conscientious objection to specific wars, but that has been rejected. So currently, a conscientious objector is someone who has a strongly held belief against war, all wars.
So there's a couple of interesting questions, sort of they're tied together. One is what counts as violence, and adjacent to that is a reminder that Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple. So does that count as a as a violent act. And, in some tellings of the story, he just, overturned tables. I think in one of the versions, he makes a whip. So he uses perhaps a weapon in one of them. What counts as violence? And was Jesus being nonviolent? Can we call Jesus nonviolent, especially if he took a whip to the money changers? I'll let you guys answer that question.
Well, I can take a stab at that. I will say that in our peace discernment process, at one of the consultations where we had several outstanding biblical theologians, this came up. I think we spent 45 minutes going back and forth about it at least. So yes, it's an issue. I think scholars tend to make a distinction between violence against persons and violence against property, so that if Jesus was very firm and passionate and overturning tables, one could say he was animated, he was aggressive, he was angry, but not violent against persons. If cracking the whip sent the animals out and had people running, one could say that was a violent act, but it also has the sense of anger rather than inflicting harm. The other thing is that the braided thing, the idea that Jesus took the time to braid the whip suggests this was not a spontaneous act of anger in the moment, but that he was very deliberate and he was making a point. And so that tends to suggest that the way Jesus conducted himself was quite thoughtful and deliberate and was not losing his cool in the moment. And in that sense, looking at the body, the whole oeuvre of Jesus's life and teachings, one could see a restraint when it came to violence against persons.
Okay. Anybody else want to address that issue? One of the things that I would say, how I identify myself, if someone was had invaded my home and was attacking a member of my family, and I happen to have a baseball bat, I would probably use the baseball bat and feel justified by it. What I wouldn't do is find out where the attacker lived and then attack his family or attack his neighbors. And so I think which is what the way warfare tends to be carried out. I think that's a distinction I make, and I don't know if that's a helpful distinction or not, or maybe I'm just justifying my own sort of inner aggression. I don't know. But Marilyn or Jeff, do any of you want to continue on that? Yeah, go ahead, Marilyn.
For me, these are conversations. They're not necessarily questions with determined or right or wrong answers, but they're conversations, and they're great conversations to have in the church. We've done this in our church, and we've done, there's an exercise where you line up on a spectrum and you consider such things as football, is that violent, and how you address the insect infestation in your home and all of those things. And they just help people think about this question and define where they are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Here is a question that is asked. What about, are we doing anything to address violence in our communities? Or do we have resources for addressing violence in our communities? And the example given is, there are gangs in a lot of our communities. There are, sort of violence associated with the trafficking of drugs and, contraband of various kinds. And so what are we doing about that? Gun violence. In my own community, we had a mass shooting in Oakland the day before yesterday, but it hasn't gotten a lot of attention because there have been two other much bigger mass shootings in California. So what are we doing about sort of the broad kinds of, the kinds of violence which are happening in our community? And I, our church is doing some stuff, not necessarily fundamentally tied to being a peace church, but we have been historically involved in some work around addressing gun violence. But how about your other congregations? What have you guys been doing for these other kinds of violence in your communities?
So we did the No Guns in God's House program, and I think the peacemaking program helped provide resources for that. That resulted in some really good discussions and coming up with a policy about guns on our campus. I want to point people to the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship website. This group involved in this webinar is mostly concerned with war, but we have working groups that are specifically focusing on gun violence and also police and violence and incarceration. And so there are a lot of ways to begin to approach all of the structural violence in our culture. And I think joining the Peace Fellowship is a good way to start.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, there's a specific question, Jeff, that I think you can answer about. It says, when taking the inventory of conscience, where do the results go and how are they kept confidential? Those were questions which were raised by a congregation that was considering to use them. So that would be a good one to answer.
Right. Well, the information, in order to send it back to the user, we have to collect it into a database. And so we do have that information in a database that only a couple of people have access to. But in order to send that information to them, we have to, and we also collect demographic information, which is at the end of the survey, just so that we can identify what segment of folks are taking it, but that is anonymized.
Thank you. There's another question about questions about conscientious objectors and paying taxes. Can we be conscientious objectors and deduct the percentage of our taxes that would go towards the defense of the budget? And what's the then a follow-up question, which is kind of interesting. What's the definition of defense anyway? The first part of that question, I think, is a simple yes or no, and I'm not qualified to answer it. So can any of you talk about deducting taxes that might otherwise go towards war? I'm going to say I don't think you can, but talk to your tax advisor.
There is a documentary called The Pacifist, which I've seen lately, and it's about a strict pacifist who refuses to pay taxes, knowing that some of the money will go toward war and war planning. And he's been very upfront about doing that, and so far has heard from the IRS that this is not allowed and that he's afoul of the law. But so far that has been not met with any consequences other than that notification. But again, it's quite right for people to really research that carefully. It's obviously frowned upon by the authorities.
My wife and I were considering, not paying half of our taxes because half of our taxes go to half of the discretionary taxes go to war. But then we realized, well, if we did that, then a quarter of our taxes would be going to war, and we'd still, and then we would just be getting in trouble and not being effective enough. Okay, so here's a question which has come up. Oh, actually, any other responses to my thing about taxes and pacifism? Okay. So, there's another question about violence in our communities. I mean, there's a lot of blame going around, blaming refugees, blaming immigrants for the violence, and how do we address that? That's a little bit beyond the scope of what a peace church does, but it's still important, and it's an issue that's dear to my heart because 2 of my children are immigrants and people of color, and so it's something that I hope we're all doing, and I hope we're all engaged in efforts to diffuse the hatred and in a positive way proclaim the kingdom of God, which is a place of where everyone's welcome and everybody's valued. But any specific things that you want to talk about in your congregations where you're doing that? Here's another question, which I think is really important. This person says that their congregation has an unofficial policy of avoiding political conversations. So that being the case, how do we introduce this this conversation, which certainly has political implications and overtones? And I don't, Marilyn, how did you do that in your church, or did you, or is your church okay with politics?
Our church is okay with politics, but I think this question should point to the curriculum that we've provided the link to online. Take a look at it. There are things, talking about the Bible that may or may not become political. Doing the inventory of conscience will lead to tremendous conversations. So just look through that curriculum, pick and choose what you think would work, and try it and see where it goes.
And I think that the resource file that you helped to make available, Marilyn, has other suggestions for nonviolence responses to violence and war. Is that right?
Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I would just echo what Marilyn has said. In my experience, the deepest convictions that lead us to peace are not of a partisan political nature. They go to questions of conscience and deepest values, and it is possible that someone could come to those decisions through a deep engagement of discernment aided by our curriculum, and never talk about the Republican or the Democratic Party. At some point, there's going to be engagement with the powers and the realities, but I think the coming to conviction, I don't think we talk about Democrats and Republicans or any of that in the curriculum per se. We're getting at the deeper values and the questions of conscience, and we invite anybody wherever they are in terms of party affiliation or whatever to participate in that. I think a church that has said we're going to steer clear of political conversations or politics could in good conscience say, let's do the discernment together, knowing that there's no reference to those things specifically in the curriculum.
Yeah, and I would add that, so I believe personally, and this is what I've tried to frame, because I think all of our congregations want to at least be a place where everyone's welcome, and also there's a concern about, the first, the separation of church and state, and are we even allowed to talk about politics, even if we might want to. But I think there's a difference between politics and social morality. And when it comes to issues of war, neither of the two major American political parties is pacifist. I don't think there's any, when I think that exactly when the United States declared war on Afghanistan, exactly one congressperson opposed that war publicly. And that happened to be my congresswoman, Barbara Lee, who, of course, I love her, but one person. So one thing that we're a terribly divided country, but one thing that unites us is a willingness to go to war. And so it's whether or not this is politics or public morality, it's a little different if you're opposing one war that, like when I was opposing, even opposing the war in Iraq, that was pretty unified thing. So it gets a little dicier in other questions. But I think it's important to distinguish between politics and social morality. And the truth is, if we look historically, many of the times when we feel most proud of what Christians have done, whether it was American Christians standing up against slavery, or American Christians supporting civil rights in this country. American Christians, the few American Christians that publicly opposed the internment of Japanese Americans, Christians who have, spoken up in various times. They often were accused of being political, and it becomes a way to dismiss questions of public morality. So it's an interesting question. I think it's a good question, and and here's someone saying politics equals partisan concerns. Yeah, I don't. First of all, I think it's a whether you're talking about warfare or you're talking about immigration, some of these big issues, it's better not to pretend that they're just Democrats or just Republicans think one way or the other, because some of these things are both parties actually have agreement on it, and so sometimes you're opposing both parties. Anyway, that's any other thoughts? I'm trying to vamp while I'm looking at some of the questions here.
I think that's right, and I think it's important for us to have those conversations because that's where the rubber hits the road, when we're acting out of conviction of our Christian faith and our commitment to Christ and to those who are in need, and not out of our partisan affiliation. And I think that's the real power of working together and having these conversations to help us kind of make a distinction between those concerns and help people to clarify why this is an important conversation to have.
So a member of the our Peace Church working group, Bill Galvin, has posted a sort of a follow-up to our question about being a pacifist and withholding taxes. He said a number of conscientious objectors have withheld all or part of their taxes because of their objection to paying for war. Usually the government just takes the money from their bank accounts or paychecks, plus interest and penalties. On rare occasions, such folks have gone to jail.
Mm.
So it's not as, yeah. My wife and I are actually considering moving to Andorra, but that's more fun than having, but we still have to pay US taxes. So question, another question, our Peace Church started using the new Peace Church curriculum, and one of the overriding comments has been, where do we get information on alternatives to war making and militarism, especially with our current war in Ukraine and Russia? So where else can we get, what are some good resources that you know about? And I don't know, Simon, we may be asking too much to you to throw these in the chat, but maybe some of you who are participating can put answers in the chat. But panelists, where would you go for other resources?
Well, I think I tried to answer that question earlier when I suggested that the resource file that is part of the curriculum or referenced in the curriculum has links to a lot of other resources that I think would be helpful in this regard.
Yeah,
I would also mention a book. I can't recall the exact title, but it's on the war in Ukraine, and it's by Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies. And Medea Benjamin is with Code Pink, and Nicholas Davies is an investigative journalist. It's a brief little primer, but very well put together. It's just out, so it's quite current, and the tone is really good. It's careful and respectful, but doesn't dodge any of the tough issues. I'd recommend that little book.
thank you. That's going to be the last question. I see here that we are nearing the end of our time, and I want to end with a word of gratitude to you all for coming and being part of this event. And I also want to end with a word of gratitude to God, who calls us and marks us, transforms us by grace, and gives us the strength and the hope and the courage to go out into the world and proclaim the gospel of peace. And may the blessings of this God be with you. May they strengthen you. May they give you hope. Amen.
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 Having said that, I don't know if I have glossed over any concluding remarks that need to be made by someone besides me there. If not, God's peace be with you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.